welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hi, this is Jessica with Turn the Page podcast, and I am here with an author who wrote a really cool retelling of a Shakespeare play that we don't really see a lot of adaptations of. I feel like I was talking about this book with my colleague, Jen, who does some interviews as well. And, she asked me what I was working on this morning, and I told her, and she was like, you pretty much see the same adaptations over and over again, which is not to say that they're bad, but it is refreshing to see something brand new, especially a play that I did not know anything about when I started reading The Hollow Bones. So welcome, Erica Wright. Please tell us about this book and how you came to write it.
Sure. Thank you so much. Well, Hollow Bones it's a retelling of Shakespeare's play, Measure for Measure, with a sort of contemporary thriller twist. It's set around a snake-handling Pentecostal church that burns to the ground, and unfortunately there are two people inside. So it's really a story about the motivations and this one particular character, Essa, who was very closely connected to the church and thought she had left it in her past, I should say. And in terms of how this book occurred to me, I actually had the idea more than a decade ago. I was living in Atlanta and I found a copy of Measure for Measure, which has always been one of my favorite Shakespeare plays, from the Yale University Library. And it's this old, beautiful edition. It was just a couple of bucks. Sometimes you get lucky that way and find things in antique shops. And I reread it and I thought, oh, I wish I were a theater director, because it would be really cool if this were set around a snake handling church, this sort of insular, slightly odd religious community, fervent, but of course ripe with the potential for abuse because it's so small and insular. But I'm not a theater director, so I sort of shelved that idea. And then many years later, I just couldn't get it out of my head, which is typically how I approach projects. If I'm obsessed with it, I can't stop thinking about it, I decide, well, I'll at least try.
So, first of all, so Measure for Measure was one of your favorites. Tell us a little bit about why you liked it so much. One thing, when I did a little bit of research into it, I was surprised that it's described as a comedy, I believe.
Oh, yes.
It is not a comedy, in my opinion, at
No.
all. And I also want to just obviously come back to just the characters and the whole idea of this snake handling church, because that was fascinating as well. But yeah, tell us a little bit about why Measure for Measure was one of your favorites, and just sort of like, how would you categorize it?
Well, I certainly wouldn't call it a comedy. I have seen that description before, but it's also not a tragedy. There is one kind of off-page death in the play. But I think it's probably one of the problem plays, which I just love to dig into those problem plays because they're strange, right? Why write about these kind of gray areas and these complicated people? But in terms of what drew me to the play, when I was in high school, I went to the Alabama Shakespeare Festival, which is in Montgomery, Alabama. It's an annual event. It still takes place, and I assume it's still of this wonderful high caliber. And I think I saw 3 plays that weekend, 2 of which I had read. I think maybe The Tempest they did, and it was wonderful. But then I had not read Measure for Measure. And it's a fun experience to see a Shakespeare play, never having seen it before. And all you have is that little kind of description in the program, right? Which probably called it a comedy. And I was just immediately taken with the character of Isabella's situation. It's the night before she is to enter a convent, and she is excited to enter this convent. This is what she has always wanted. She is a fervent, devout believer. And then on the evening of her, she's in prayers, someone comes to her and says, your brother has been condemned to death for impregnating his fiance. Can you please plead for his life? So obviously that disrupts her entire life, disrupts her plans. And she does. And she makes this extraordinary, beautiful speech about mercy to the man in charge, Angelo. And he, instead of being swayed by her pleas, becomes obsessed with her physically and offers her basically a devil's bargain, which is that if she sleeps with him, pardon her brother. And oh, you just feel for Isabella so much. For her, she fervently believes that if she sleeps with Angelo, she's going to hell. She's sacrificing her entire life. But there's also just this sort of, I don't know, it just feels very contemporary. This idea of this man in power kind of abusing that power for this young girl. So I just was always struck by Isabella and wanted to, what happened afterwards? That's, I think, why I was so drawn to this play.
Yeah, for sure. And one thing that I kind of, again, when I was doing research about the play and just the whole story, I think as far as the comedy thing goes, I think somebody had mentioned just that the wordplay, was fun and often is one of the reasons why it might have been categorized in that way. But getting back to just the story of Angelo and Isabella, it reminded me a little bit of Hunchback of Notre Dame, in
Right.
in the fact that, you have Frollo, who is this supposedly devout gentleman who is like obsessed with the forbidden fruit, for lack of a better word, although I do not believe Esmeralda was a nun. But it's just that sort of level of, I don't know what to say, like piety, that it almost is like any sort of lust sort of pushes you the other way. And, denying yourself so much makes you want to really do the thing that you're not supposed to be doing and you're hurting other people to do. So I that was in the back of my mind. But in this story, so you have Essa and her brother Clyde. Clyde would be the Claudio character. Juliet, which is the name of the character in Shakespeare. I suppose he liked that name. That was like one of the common names he used a lot. But she is a card reader. She does tarot card reading. And then on the other end, you have Pastor Micah, who, oh my goodness, is the creepiest character. He was the serpent himself, really. The whole thing with the snakes, which again, I want to ask you about because that's wild. He did this thing in his church where he would handle these snakes, and supposedly, if you like really believed, they wouldn't be of harm to you. But obviously, if we're going to follow the story of Measure for Measure, Essa, who is not a nun, but she is more of the chaste character, she's the one he's lusting after, and he's got a connection with her as well, which I want readers to kind of figure out. But I think my question was, why did you choose a snake handling Pentecostal church? It is very different than, we see a lot of books that take place in communities that have these small community churches. Why specifically a snake handling one? And is that something that exists?
Yeah, absolutely. So a few years back, I wrote an essay collection about snakes called Snake, very creatively, in sort of various the sort of mythology of snakes and pop culture, contemporary culture. And yes, there are and were these serpent handling, they would call them, serpent handling Pentecostal churches. They were very widespread in parts of the South, particularly Appalachia, 50, 100 years ago. In fact, where I live now in Knoxville, East Tennessee was known as being kind of the hub of these types of churches. And there's a really wonderful documentary for anyone who's interested called Holy Ghost People by Peter Adair. I think it was out in the 60s. And what I was struck by when I was watching this documentary for research is that in the 60s, the people do not come across as strange in the interviews. They come across actually as very kind of community minded and, genuine believers. And that to me was almost more shocking than the snakes, that they're there and even now I've got chills just thinking about it. And the idea was that they were kind of basing their faith on this passage in the book of Mark, which says, you shall take up serpents and not be harmed. And yeah, so I was really fascinated by this. They are illegal now in every state except for West Virginia, which is where the book is set. And they are, I think there's fewer. It's hard to tell because some of them still function secretly, but there probably are fewer than 100 left in the US. So it's not very popular anymore, perhaps for obvious reasons. A lot of people died. A lot of people got bitten by the snakes and died, unfortunately. And but they do still exist. And I just thought it worked. It just worked for the story. I had this idea, it just kind of appeared to me. Again, I thought it would be really cool as a production. And then I thought, well, why don't I try to write it as a book? And that will also allow me to spend more time with Isabella and think about her life and give her a little more agency, which was fun.
So there's also some media stuff that goes on in this. I mean, the book opens where somebody is actually sort of interviewing Pastor Micah about this whole church situation, and it kind of feeds into shining a light on the plight of Essa and just the whole community in general. How did that part come together? Did you immediately know that it was going to be part of the plot to, again, shine a light on the fact that obviously all is not well in this community?
Right. Definitely wasn't my original intention. I really started with this obsession of the idea of this church and Isabella. But then as I started writing it, I thought, well, I'm fascinated by this. I would think that if there were this popular church that was doing these sort of older practices and no one was getting hurt, right? That was what was interesting. Sort of, it seemed to be something was happening there. I won't call it magic, but something was happening where no one was getting bitten in this new church under this new leadership. And I thought, well, the media would be interested, right? I would think that there would be people kind of sniffing around. And then I realized that would, one, give Pastor Micah even more power because he's, popular in the community. He's making a lot of money. He's able to do a lot of good. And then it also, what really clicked for me when I figured out how to make this work as a mystery is I realized, oh, I think this reporter, though, she's smart. I think she would be investigating. I don't think she would just want to be passive, especially after that first chapter encounter with Pastor Micah, which does not go well. So I thought, oh, I'm going to give at least one character a lot of agency and see what she can do with it.
And then when reframing the other characters, Juliet, I really liked her whole story that she is, again, on the other end of this community. Obviously, she's reading cards and she doesn't just read them to make money. She really, really believes in the tarot card practice and her practice. And she's also carrying Essa's future niece or nephew, Clyde's baby, and Clyde is the one who Essa is trying to help. Again, in reframing this in a modern setting, how did you kind of come to where all the characters were going to be? Like, what really just fit for you that Isabella was going to become Essa, and what her situation was, Clyde, and then Juliet on the other side?
Well, Juliet is so briefly in the original play. I think she maybe has a couple of lines. She doesn't have any agency at all. And her fiance is, of course, sentenced to death. She's about to be a single mom under these very tragic circumstances. So she was another character that I just felt like, honestly, I thought it would be fun to give her more of a voice and give her more of a sense of agency. And the idea of her being someone who reads cards for others, it came to me because I was thinking about ideas of faith, the sort of different, what is this such a broad term. And I wanted to complicate it and explore it a little bit. So what can you have faith in? What works? What helps you? What doesn't? And it was nice to have her in contrast to Essa, who no longer belongs to a church, but is still very faithful. She's, still believes. She just doesn't believe that these churches are the right way to go. And Juliet also fervent believer in the afterlife and be able to communicate with the dead, just what would be seen perhaps as almost the opposite of the sort of Christian perspective, this pagan perspective. So she was really fun to write. I did have to do more research for her. I did no research for Essay because I'd already completed it for my Snake book. So I took a class on tarot reading. I read books about divination and really was starting from zero, which is a fun place to start, but also a scary place to start because I know I got things wrong even in the end, but it was still fun to dive into these new territories.
So now that this book is out, what are you thinking of for the future? Did you want to continue on adaptations, or do you have something else in mind for a future project?
I love retellings. I was just looking through my Goodreads list. That's how I keep track of what I've read because otherwise I forget. And I've read so many. There is something like you're saying, the popular ones get rewritten again and again, but I can read them again and again, apparently. I think I've read 10 Jane Eyre retellings and liked many of them. But no, I think for me, I'm going to move on from here. I'm working on a new mystery that's set in a sort of fictional version of Cassadaga, Florida, which is known as the, you're nodding along, which is known as the psychic capital of the world. So I did kind of go down another rabbit hole with the idea of mediumship and spiritualism, and I am not quite ready to leave that behind. So my new mystery will also have elements of that.
Very cool. I definitely want to read that one.
Thank
So
you.
what do you like to read yourself? Are you a mystery reader? Do you prefer a completely different genre?
I know I love reading. I love reading mysteries. I read a lot of mysteries. I just reread all of Tana French recently, which is a funny thing to do, sort of start to finish. And but what I read most recently was oh wow, Remains of the Day. It sort of blanked on it for a second, which I had never read before. So it was fun to go back to Ishiguro. A friend of mine said that it was just a masterpiece, and I feel like that word was like, okay. I had read Ishiguro's Never Let Me Go, and I think I sort of mourned for 5 years. And I was like, I'm not sure if I want to go back into this, but it's a very different book, devastating in its own way, but much, I would say, a quieter masterpiece.
Yeah, Never Let Me Go. Whoa, I think about that one a lot.
Same.
Well, thank you so much. This was great. Check out The Hollow Bones. Oh, the title. Where did it come from? Tell us about that.
Oh, the title is from Shakespeare. It's from the play. I'm going to have to look it up real quick. Thy bones are hollow, impiety has made a feast of thee. And I just thought that was a nice way to focus on the book's themes. And also, I think of Essa as being a little bit bird-like, sort of strong, but small but mighty. So it worked.
I love it. Well, thanks again. Once again, this was Jessica, Turn the Page podcast from Syosset Public Library. Our guest today was
Erica Wright.
And we are going to close this chapter of Turn the Page.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.